The thunderous hooves of a dozen horses pounded against the hard, packed earth as Felicity Zimmerman clutched her infant son to her chest, hiding in the abandoned barn that smelled of hay and broken dreams. 6 months a widow, and the whispers of Copper Creek still followed her like hungry wolves. Her husband James had been dead a full 3 months before little Thomas was born, and the arithmetic of that truth was something the small Colorado town of 1878 couldn't seem to forgive. The horses grew louder, then stopped. Felicity's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed deeper into the shadows of the hayloft. The floorboards beneath her creaked as she shifted her weight. Thomas stirred in her arms, his tiny face scrunching up in preparation for a cry that would surely give them away. "SHH, my love," she whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead. "Please, not now." The barn door swung open below, wood groaning against rusted hinges. Dust motes danced in the shaft of late afternoon sunlight that cut through the dimness. "Mrs. Zimmerman," a deep voice called out. Felicity Zimmerman. She held her breath, one hand gently covering her baby's mouth. There was nowhere left to run. 4 days on the trail with barely any supplies had brought her to the edge of exhaustion. The posse from town had finally caught up. "I know you're in here, madam. I can see your tracks plain as day." The voice wasn't angry, but firm. "Nobody here means you or your child any harm." Felicity didn't believe that for a second. The town council had made their intentions clear. They would take her baby, a child born of sin, they claimed, and place him with a proper family. And Felicity would be sent away, her reputation beyond salvation. Heavy boots climbed the ladder to the loft. Felicity pressed herself against the wall, clutching Thomas to her chest. As the stranger's head appeared above the floor of the loft, Felicity finally saw him clearly. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beneath his dusty hat and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wasn't from Copper Creek, that much she knew for certain. "Stay back," she warned, her voice shaking. "I have nothing left to lose." The man held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Name's Preston Zane, madam. I own the Triple Z Ranch about 20 miles north of here." He kept his distance, remaining at the top of the ladder. "I'm not with those men from town." "Then why are you here? How did you find me?" Felicity asked, suspicion lacing every word. "I was tracking the posse, figured they weren't up to any good, hunting down a woman and her baby." He took off his hat, revealing a full head of dark hair with a slight curl to it. "They're searching the creek about a mile east. Won't be long before they double back." Felicity clutched Thomas tighter. "What do you want from us?" Preston Zane's expression softened. "Nothing, madam. But I'd like to help if you'll let me." He glanced down at the baby. "May I see him?" "Why?" she asked, fear rising in her throat. "Because if what folks are saying is true, that baby was born 6 months after your husband died." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "Well, then I think I might have a stake in this matter." Felicity's eyes widened in shock. What are you saying?" "I'm saying show me that child, Mrs. Zimmerman, because if my suspicions are correct, he's mine too now." The world seemed to stop spinning as Felicity stared at the stranger before her. She remembered a night nearly a year and a half ago when James had been gone for months on a cattle drive. A stranger passing through town, a moment of weakness and loneliness in the midst of a terrible storm. One night of comfort that she had buried deep in her memory, ashamed and guilty. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned Thomas to face the man. The baby blinked up at Preston Zane with curious eyes the exact same shade of gray as the man standing before them. Preston's breath caught audibly. "I thought as much," he whispered. "Looks just like my pa." He swallowed hard, then extended his hand toward Felicity. "Mrs. Zimmerman, I believe we have a lot to discuss, but right now we need to get you and our sons somewhere safe." The sound of approaching horses cut through the moment. Preston's head snapped toward the barn entrance. "We've got about 2 minutes before they're on us. Do you trust me?" Felicity looked at the hand extended toward her, then at the baby in her arms, a baby with this stranger's eyes. What choice did she have? "I don't even know you," she whispered. "No, madam, you don't, but I know enough about you to risk my hide getting you away from those men." His hand remained steady. "And I know that's my son you're holding." Felicity took his hand. Preston led them down from the loft and to the back of the barn where his horse waited. "My ranch is a day's ride from here." he explained, helping her onto the horse before mounting behind her. It's not much, but it's growing. You'll be safe there. As they rode away from the barn, Felicity could hear the shouts of the men from Copper Creek discovering their abandoned camp. But Preston guided his horse through a shallow stream, obscuring their tracks as they headed north, away from her past and toward an uncertain future. They rode in silence for hours, the baby nestled securely between them. When night fell, Preston found a sheltered hollow beside a small spring. He built a small fire, careful to keep it low and hidden. "I won't ask what happened between us," Preston said as he handed Felicity a tin cup of coffee. "That night in town, I was passing through on my way back from Denver. There was that terrible storm." "The Golden Eagle Saloon," Felicity said softly. "You bought me a drink when some cowboys were getting too familiar." Preston nodded, surprise evident on his face. "You remember." "I remember everything," she admitted, her eyes on the fire. "James had been gone 6 months on that cattle drive. I'd received word that they were delayed again. I was lonely and afraid and—" "You don't owe me explanations, Mrs. Zimmerman." "Felicity," she corrected him. "And I think I do. Thomas is your son." Preston's gaze moved to the sleeping infant, wrapped in Felicity's shawl. "I never thought I'd have a family," he said quietly. "My life isn't suited for it, or at least I didn't think it was." "What are you proposing, Mr. Zane?" "Preston," he corrected with a small smile. "And I'm not proposing anything yet. First, I'm going to get you and Thomas safely to my ranch. Then we can figure out what comes next." "Those men won't stop looking," Felicity warned. "They're determined to take him from me." "Let them try," Preston's voice hardened. "Triple Z land is mine, fair and square. No town council has any authority there." They left at first light, riding steadily through the day. As the sun began to set on their second day of travel, Felicity caught sight of a large wooden arch spanning a well-maintained dirt road. The words Triple Z Ranch were burned into the crossbeam. "Welcome home," Preston said, his voice rumbling against her back. "Such as it is." The main house was larger than Felicity had expected, a 2-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several smaller cabins dotted the property, and in the distance, she could see a bunkhouse, stables, and a corral where several horses grazed. As they approached, an older woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her weathered face broke into a wide smile when she saw Preston. "There you are. We were starting to worry you'd—" She stopped short when she noticed Felicity and the baby. "Preston Zane, what have you done now?" Preston dismounted and helped Felicity down. "Mrs. Miller, this is Felicity Zimmerman and her son, Thomas. They'll be staying with us for a while." Mrs. Miller's eyebrows shot up, but she recovered quickly. "Well then, you must be exhausted, dear. Come inside and let's get you settled." The housekeeper led Felicity into the house while Preston took care of the horse. The interior was simple but comfortable, with solid furniture and clean, if well-worn furnishings. "Mr. Zane isn't married?" Felicity asked hesitantly as Mrs. Miller showed her to a bedroom on the 2nd floor. "That man," Mrs. Miller chuckled. "He spends more time with his cattle than with people. Been running this place for 8 years, ever since his father passed, built it up from nearly nothing." She glanced at the baby. "Though I must say, this is quite a surprise." Before Felicity could respond, Preston appeared in the doorway, carrying her small bag of belongings. "Mrs. Miller, I trust you can find something for supper. Mrs. Zimmerman and the boy have had a long journey. Of course, there's stew on the stove." Mrs. Miller gave Felicity a reassuring pat on the arm before bustling away. Left alone with Preston, Felicity suddenly felt overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she admitted. "You're keeping your son safe," Preston replied simply. "And I'm meeting mine for the first time." He approached cautiously, peering down at Thomas, who was now awake and looking around with curious eyes. "May I hold him?" With only slight hesitation, Felicity transferred the baby into Preston's arms. The man's large, rough hands handled the infant with surprising gentleness. Thomas looked up at Preston, his tiny fingers reaching for the man's face. "Hello there, little man," Preston said softly. "I'm your pa." Something shifted in Felicity's heart at the sight of this rugged rancher holding her son with such tenderness. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. That night, after a hearty meal, Preston showed Felicity around the house. "You and Thomas will stay in the guest room for now. My room is just down the hall if you need anything." "What happens tomorrow?" Felicity asked. Preston leaned against the doorframe, considering her question. "Tomorrow I go back to running my ranch. You rest and recover from your journey. And then we figure out what's next. I can't stay here indefinitely, living off your charity." "It's not charity when it's for my son," Preston replied firmly. "But you're right, we need a more permanent arrangement." He hesitated, then added, "The people in these parts respect a marriage." "If we were to wed, marry," Felicity gasped. "We barely know each other. I'm not suggesting we marry tomorrow," Preston clarified, "but it would protect both you and Thomas. Give you both my name, my protection, and silence any gossip before it starts." Felicity sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "I need time to think." "Of course." Preston nodded, his expression understanding. "Take all the time you need, but know that whatever you decide, you both have a place here. I won't turn my back on my son." He paused at the door. "Or on the woman who braved everything to protect him." The following days established a tentative routine. Preston rose early to work the ranch with his small crew of cowboys, while Felicity helped Mrs. Miller with household tasks. In the evenings, Preston would spend time with Thomas, his rough features softening as he played with his son. A week after their arrival, Felicity was hanging laundry in the yard when she noticed a cloud of dust approaching along the road. Her heart raced as she grabbed Thomas from his basket and hurried toward the house. Preston was already striding across the yard, rifle in hand. "Get inside," he instructed calmly. "Stay with Mrs. Miller." From the window, Felicity watched as 3 riders approached. She recognized Sheriff Harding from Copper Creek, along with 2 members of the town council. Cold fear washed over her. "They've found us," she whispered to Mrs. Miller, who stood beside her with a grim expression. "Don't you worry, dear. Mr. Zane won't let anything happen to you or that baby." Outside, Preston stood tall as the men dismounted. "Sheriff," he greeted them coolly. "What brings you to Triple Z?" "You know damn well what," Sheriff Harding replied. "We're looking for Felicity Zimmerman and her illegitimate child." Trail led straight to your property. "Mrs. Zimmerman is indeed here," Preston confirmed, his voice level. "As is her son, my son." The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "Your son, that's right. Thomas is my flesh and blood, born before Mrs. Zimmerman's late husband returned from his cattle drive." Preston's hand rested casually on his holstered pistol. "Which makes this a family matter, and none of Copper Creek's concern." "That ain't what people are saying," one of the councilmen interjected. "They're saying that baby was born well after Zimmerman died." "People talk a lot of nonsense," Preston replied. "The truth is that boy is mine, and Mrs. Zimmerman and I are discussing our future arrangements. Now, unless you have official business here, I suggest you move along." Sheriff Harding studied Preston for a long moment. "Zane, I've known you to be an honest man. If you're claiming that child, I'll take your word, but folks in town won't be so easily convinced." "I don't much care what folks in town think," Preston said. "This is Triple Z land, my family, my business." After a tense moment, the sheriff nodded. "Fair enough, but this isn't the end of it. That woman left town under suspicious circumstances." "She left town because people threatened to take her child." Preston's voice hardened. "How would you have responded, Sheriff?" The lawman had no reply to that. With a curt nod, he mounted his horse. "We'll be watching, Zane. You do that," Preston replied evenly. "Safe journey back to town." Once the riders were out of sight, Preston came inside. Felicity stood in the parlor, clutching Thomas to her chest, her face pale with fear. "They're gone for now," Preston assured her. "But the sheriff's right. This isn't over." "What do we do?" she asked. Preston ran a hand through his hair, thinking. "We need to make this official. If you're willing, we should marry as soon as possible. It will strengthen our claim that Thomas is mine, born before your husband's return." Felicity's mind raced. Marriage to a man she barely knew, a man with whom she'd shared only a single night more than a year ago, and yet he'd already risked so much for her and Thomas. She looked at his steady gray eyes, so like her son's, and found herself nodding. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." 3 days later, A circuit preacher passing through performed a simple ceremony in the ranch house parlor. Felicity wore her best dress, a faded blue calico that Mrs. Miller had helped alter to fit her better. Preston wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his usually unruly hair slicked back with water. The vows were traditional, spoken without embellishment but with clear intent. When Preston slipped a simple gold band onto Felicity's finger, his mother's ring, he'd told her she felt a strange mixture of gratitude and trepidation. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced. Preston leaned down, hesitating just a moment before pressing his lips gently against hers. It was their first kiss since that night at the Golden Eagle, and Felicity was surprised by the warmth that spread through her at his touch. As the small gathering of ranch hands and neighbors congratulated them, Preston kept a protective arm around Felicity's waist. "Mrs. Zane," he whispered in her ear, testing the sound of it. "It sounds strange," she admitted. "You'll get used to it," he replied with a small smile. "We both will." That night, after the celebrations had ended and Thomas was asleep in his cradle, Felicity stood nervously in what was now their bedroom. Preston entered quietly, closing the door behind him. "I can sleep elsewhere tonight," he offered immediately, sensing her discomfort. "Just because we're married doesn't mean no," Felicity interrupted. "This is your room, your home. I don't want to displace you." Preston approached her slowly. "It's our home now, yours, mine, and Thomas's." He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I know this isn't a love match, Felicity, but I hope we can build something real between us, for Thomas's sake, and maybe for our own." Felicity looked up at him, studying the earnest expression on his face. "I think I'd like that," she admitted softly. Preston's smile was warm as he leaned down to kiss her, more confidently this time. Felicity responded, allowing herself to remember the attraction she'd felt for him that night in the saloon. It hadn't just been loneliness that had drawn her to him then. There had been something in his quiet strength, his gentle manner despite his imposing presence. When they broke apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "We have time," he whispered. "All the time we need." The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm. Preston taught Felicity about the ranch, the cattle operations, the breeding program he was developing for stronger stock, the plans for expansion. Felicity took over management of the household, bringing order to what had clearly been a bachelor's domain for too long. At night, their relationship slowly deepened. Preston was patient, never pushing for more than Felicity was ready to give. Sometimes they would simply talk late into the night, sharing stories of their lives before they met. Preston spoke of his father, a tough but fair man who had taught him everything about ranching. Felicity told him about her childhood in St. Louis, her dreams of adventure that had led her west, and her marriage to James, a good man, if not a passionate love. "I did care for him," she confessed one night as they lay side by side. "But we married because it was expected, not because our hearts demanded it." Preston's hand found hers in the darkness. "And that night at the Golden Eagle, what did your heart demand then?" Felicity turned to face him, his features barely visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Comfort at first," she admitted, "but there was something more, something about you that made me feel safe even then." Preston's thumb traced circles on her palm. "I never forgot you," he said quietly. "I thought about going back to find you, but I figured you were a married woman. It wasn't my place." "And now?" Felicity asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now you're my wife," Preston replied, drawing her closer. "And I'm finding that means more to me than I expected." As summer turned to fall, Felicity noticed changes in Preston. He began returning to the house earlier in the evenings, eager to spend time with her and Thomas. He brought her wildflowers he found while checking fence lines, and once, a beautiful silver hairbrush he'd ordered specially from Denver. "What's this for?" she asked, running her fingers over the intricate pattern on the back. "Do I need a reason to give my wife a gift?" He responded with a smile that made her heart flutter. One crisp October morning, Felicity woke to find Preston already gone from their bed. Unusual, as he typically waited to say goodbye before heading out for the day. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Mrs. Miller preparing breakfast. "Where's Preston?" she asked, lifting Thomas from his cradle where he'd been contentedly playing with a wooden rattle. "Left before dawn," Mrs. Miller replied, setting a cup of coffee before Felicity. "Said he had business in town, seemed mighty secretive about it." Felicity tried not to worry as the day progressed, but by mid-afternoon her concern had grown. Preston rarely went to town without telling her his plans. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching, she hurried to the porch, relief washing over her at the sight of Preston riding up the path. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came a wagon driven by a stranger, loaded with lumber and what appeared to be furniture. "What's all this?" Felicity asked as Preston dismounted. "A surprise," he answered, his eyes bright with excitement. "For you and Thomas." He took her hand, leading her toward the west side of the house where a flat stretch of ground had been cleared weeks earlier. "I've been planning this for a while now." The wagon driver began unloading, revealing a rocking chair, a small writing desk, and several crates of books. "I know you miss reading," Preston explained. "You mentioned it was one of your favorite pastimes in St. Louis, so I'm building you a proper library. An extension to the house right here," he gestured to the cleared area, "with windows facing the mountains so you can have the best view on the property." Felicity stood speechless, her eyes filling with tears. "Don't you like it?" Preston asked, suddenly uncertain. "Like it?" Felicity's voice broke. "Preston, no one has ever done anything like this for me." His expression softened. "You deserve it. You've brought life back to this house, Felicity. You and Thomas both." Without thinking, Felicity rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, pouring all her gratitude and growing affection into the gesture. When they broke apart, Preston looked down at her with wonder. "What was that for?" he asked, a smile playing at his lips. "Do I need a reason to kiss my husband?" She responded, echoing his words from before. That night, their lovemaking was different, deeper, more meaningful. No longer just the fulfillment of marital duties or physical need, but an expression of something that had been growing between them since that first day in the abandoned barn. As November arrived, bringing the first dusting of snow to the mountain peaks, Felicity found herself humming as she went about her chores. The library was nearly complete, a cozy room lined with bookshelves that Preston filled a few volumes at a time whenever he went to town. "You seem happy," Mrs. Miller observed one afternoon as they prepared supper together. "I am," Felicity admitted, somewhat surprised by the realization. "I never expected to find happiness again, not after everything that happened." "Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as our greatest challenges," the older woman said wisely. "Mr. Zane is a good man. I've worked for him since his father died, and I've never seen him as content as he is with you and the baby." Felicity smiled, thinking of how Preston had played with Thomas that morning, lifting the giggling infant high above his head. Her son was growing so quickly, already trying to pull himself up to stand, his gray eyes so like his father's, taking in the world with curious delight. The sound of horses approaching interrupted her thoughts. Too many horses for it to be just Preston returning. Felicity wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, her heart sinking at the sight of Sheriff Harding along with at least 5 other men riding toward the house. "Mrs. Miller, take Thomas upstairs," she instructed, her voice steady despite her fear. "Stay with him until I come for you." Once the baby was safely upstairs, Felicity stepped onto the porch, squaring her shoulders as the men dismounted. "Sheriff," she greeted him coolly. "My husband isn't here, I know," Harding replied. "Saw him headed toward the north pasture about an hour ago. That's why we came now." Cold dread washed over her. "What do you want?" One of the men stepped forward, Reverend Simmons from Copper Creek, his thin face set in righteous indignation. "We want justice, Mrs. Zimmerman, or Zane if you prefer the charade." "There's no charade," Felicity replied firmly. "Preston is my husband and Thomas's father." "That's not what the record shows," Sheriff Harding said, producing a folded document from his coat. "According to this, your son was born on May 18th of this year. Your husband James Zimmerman died on February 12th. That's more than 9 months difference." "The record is wrong," Felicity insisted, though she knew it was futile. The dates were accurate. "We've come for the child," Reverend Simmons stated. "He'll be placed with a God-fearing family in town where he won't grow up under the shadow of sin." "You're not taking my son," Felicity's hand moved to the pocket of her apron where she kept a small derringer that Preston had insisted she carry. The sheriff noticed the movement. "Don't make this worse, Mrs. Zane. We have legal authority to take the child." "What legal authority?" A deep voice called from behind the group. Preston rode up, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene. Two of his ranch hands flanked him, both armed. Sheriff Harding turned. "Court order from Judge Wilson," he said, holding up the paper. "Says the child was born out of wedlock and is to be remanded to the care of the town council." Preston dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. "That judge has no jurisdiction here. This is Triple Z land." "The law is the law, Zane," Harding replied. "I understand you're trying to do right by them, but that baby isn't yours. The dates don't lie." "That baby is mine." Preston's voice was dangerously quiet. "And anyone who tries to take him or harm my wife will answer to me." The standoff lasted several tense moments, neither side willing to back down. Finally, Reverend Simmons spoke up. "There's a simple way to resolve this. If the child truly is yours, Zane, then you must have been intimate with Mrs. Zimmerman while her husband was away on that cattle drive. That would be about August of last year. Can you prove you were in Copper Creek then?" Preston's expression didn't change. "I don't have to prove anything to you, but yes, I was passing through Copper Creek in August last year. Stayed at the boarding house for 2 nights while waiting for a shipment of supplies." "Mrs. Gunderson's boarding house?" Sheriff Harding asked, his brow furrowing. "That's right." The sheriff and the reverend exchanged glances. "She keeps meticulous records," Harding admitted reluctantly. "Then by all means, check them," Preston suggested. "You'll find I'm telling the truth." Felicity watched the exchange with growing hope. Preston had indeed stayed at the boarding house. She remembered him mentioning it that night at the saloon. Reverend Simmons wasn't satisfied. "Even if you were in town, that doesn't prove. I think it proves enough," came a new voice. Everyone turned to see a well-dressed woman riding up on a fine bay mare. Edith Gunderson, owner of the boarding house, dismounted gracefully despite her 60 years. "Mrs. Gunderson," Sheriff Harding touched the brim of his hat. "What brings you out this way? Word travels fast in small towns, Sheriff. When I heard you were gathering a posse to come out to Triple Z and take a baby from his mother, I decided to bring this." She produced a leather-bound book from her saddlebag. "My guest register from last year." She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. "August 15th through 17th, 1877, Preston Zane, room 3, paid for 2 nights. She looked up, her gaze sharp. "And if my memory serves, which it always does, he spent considerable time at the Golden Eagle those evenings." Felicity's heart swelled with gratitude for this unexpected ally. "That still doesn't prove anything improper happened between them," Reverend Simmons insisted. "No," Mrs. Gunderson agreed. "But it proves Mr. Zane could very well be that child's father, and since they're now legally married, with Mr. Zane claiming the boy as his own, I don't see what business it is of ours anymore." Sheriff Harding seemed to be wavering. "The court order was based on incomplete information," Preston interrupted firmly. "Judge Wilson didn't know I was claiming paternity. He didn't know we were married. And he sure as hell didn't know you were planning to tear a child from his mother's arms based on nothing but town gossip." The tension in the yard was palpable as the sheriff considered his options. Finally, he folded the court order and tucked it back into his coat. "I'll speak to the judge," he said. "But this isn't settled, Zane." "It is as far as I'm concerned," Preston replied, moving to stand beside Felicity. "My wife, my son, my land. There's nothing else to discuss." After a moment of tense silence, the sheriff signaled his men to mount up. As they rode away, Mrs. Gunderson remained. "I want to thank you," Felicity said, stepping forward to take the older woman's hands. "You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did," Mrs. Gunderson replied with a smile. "I've watched too many women be punished while men walk away free. Besides," she added with a meaningful glance at Preston, "I remember that night at the Golden Eagle. I saw how he looked at you, dear. Some things are simply meant to be, even if they take a winding path to get there." After Mrs. Gunderson departed, Felicity and Preston stood on the porch, watching as the sun began to set behind the mountains. "Would you really have fought them?" Felicity asked quietly. "If they'd tried to take Thomas," Preston's arm tightened around her waist. Without hesitation, he said. Though I'm glad it didn't come to that. Felicity leaned into his embrace. So am I, but this isn't over, is it? No, Preston admitted, but we'll face whatever comes together. That night, as they lay in bed with Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, Felicity finally asked the question that had been on her mind for months. Why did you help us that day in the barn? You could have just ridden past. Preston was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her arm. When I was a boy, my mother left, he finally said. She couldn't handle the isolation, the hardship of ranch life. My father never spoke of her again, but I remember how he changed after she was gone. Harder. Colder, he sighed. When I heard about a widow fleeing with her baby, something just called to me I had to see for myself. And when you saw Thomas, Felicity pressed gently. I knew, Preston said simply. The moment I saw those eyes, my father's eyes, I knew he was mine. And I swore I would never abandon my child the way my mother abandoned me. Felicity propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. But it was more than that. You could have just taken him. Preston met her gaze steadily. I remembered you, Felicity, that night at the Golden Eagle. Your laugh, your spirit. How could I separate a child from a mother who would risk everything to protect him? And now, she whispered, is it still just about Thomas? Preston reached up to cup her face in his hand. Now it's about both of you, my family, the family I never thought I'd have. His voice grew husky with emotion. I think I'm falling in love with you, Felicity Zane. The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Felicity felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized the truth of her own heart. I think I'm falling in love with you too, she admitted. I never expected this when I ran from Copper Creek. I was just trying to save my son. And instead, you saved all of us, Preston replied, drawing her down for a kiss that promised a future none of them had dared to imagine. As winter settled over the Triple Z Ranch, the threat from Copper Creek gradually faded. Judge Wilson, upon reviewing the evidence and meeting with both Felicity and Preston, rescinded his court order. There would always be gossip, of course, but it mattered less and less as their life together strengthened. Thomas took his first steps just before Christmas, tottering from Felicity's arms to Preston's outstretched hands, his face alight with triumph. Preston caught him with a whoop of joy, swinging the boy high in the air. That's my son, he proclaimed proudly, strong as his old man already. Felicity watched them, her heart full to bursting. The library Preston had built her was complete now, a warm and inviting room filled with books and comfortable furniture. Each evening, the three of them would gather their Preston reading aloud from one of the many volumes, Thomas playing on a quilt by the fire, and Felicity often working on her embroidery or simply watching her family with quiet contentment. On Christmas morning, Felicity woke to find Preston already up, Thomas sitting on his lap as they waited for her by the fire. Merry Christmas, Preston greeted her with a smile. We have something for you. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Inside, Felicity found a delicate gold locket. When she opened it, she gasped at the tiny portrait inside a perfect miniature of Preston and Thomas, painted by an artist Preston had commissioned from Denver. So we're always close to your heart, Preston explained, even when I'm out on the range. Tears filled Felicity's eyes as she fastened the locket around her neck. It's perfect, she whispered. Thank you. There's something else, Preston said, suddenly looking nervous. He set Thomas down on the quilt with his toys and took Felicity's hands in his. When we married, it was for Thomas's sake, to protect both of you. I know, Felicity nodded, wondering where this was leading. But things have changed, Preston continued. I've changed. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. He dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. Felicity Zane, I love you with all my heart, and I want to renew our vows not out of necessity or duty, but because I choose you, because I want to promise myself to you properly as a man who loves his wife. Felicity's heart soared. Yes, she said through happy tears. Yes, I would like that very much. On New Year's Day, 1879, Preston and Felicity renewed their vows in a ceremony attended by their growing circle of friends. Mrs. Miller stood beaming, holding Thomas, who was dressed in his finest clothes. Mrs. Gunderson had made the journey from town. along with several other residents who had come to accept the Zanes' version of events, or at least to respect their union. As they spoke their vows again, this time with hearts full of genuine love, Felicity thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a night of lonely comfort at the Golden Eagle Saloon, to a desperate flight from persecution, to a marriage of convenience that had blossomed into something profound and true. "I promise to love you and Thomas all the days of my life," Preston vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To protect you, provide for you, and cherish you as the greatest gifts I have ever received." "And I promise to love you," Felicity responded, "to stand by your side through whatever life brings us, and to make a home filled with warmth and joy for you and our son." As Preston sealed their vows with a kiss, applause erupted from their gathered friends. Thomas clapped his hands in delight, not understanding the significance but feeling the joy that surrounded him. Spring arrived early that year, bringing new life to the Triple Z. The cattle herd had grown, and Preston's breeding program was showing promising results. Felicity had started a vegetable garden near the house, and Thomas, now walking confidently, loved to help her plant seeds and water the young shoots. One warm May evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Felicity took Preston's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I have news," she said softly, watching his face. Preston's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Are you certain?" Felicity nodded, her smile radiant. "Doctor Mackenzie confirmed it yesterday when he came to check on Thomas's cough. We're having another baby, Preston. Around November, he thinks." Joy spread across Preston's face as he gathered her into his arms. "Another child," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child from the beginning this time. A brother or sister for Thomas," Felicity agreed, leaning into his embrace. "A family of our own making." As if on cue, Thomas toddled over from where he had been playing with wooden blocks, demanding to be included in their embrace. Preston scooped him up, settling the boy between them. "What do you think, Thomas?" Preston asked, tickling his son's belly. "Would you like a little brother or sister?" Thomas responded with delighted giggles, completely unaware of the significance of the moment, but happy to be part of it nonetheless. The months that followed were busy ones. Preston expanded the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and enlarging the kitchen. Felicity, despite her growing belly, maintained her supervision of the household and continued to help with the ranch accounts, displaying a sharp mind for business that Preston came to rely on. In late August, Sheriff Harding rode out to the Triple Z with news that silenced the last of the whispers from Copper Creek. "Judge Wilson is retiring," he informed them as they sat in Felicity's library. "His replacement is a fair man, younger, with more modern views. He's reviewed all the outstanding cases, including yours." The sheriff handed Preston an official-looking document. "This formally recognizes Thomas as your legitimate son and heir. No one can challenge it now." Relief washed over Felicity. Though the threat had diminished over time, the legal cloud had always hung over them, a distant shadow on their happiness. "Thank you for bringing this," she said sincerely. "It means more than you know." Sheriff Harding nodded, looking somewhat embarrassed. "I owe you both an apology," he admitted. "I was doing my job, but I didn't question whether it was the right thing to do." "That's in the past now," Preston said, offering his hand to the sheriff. "What matters is that my family is secure." As the sheriff departed, Felicity leaned against Preston's side, his arm automatically encircling her shoulders. "It's really over," she marveled. "Everything I feared when I ran from Copper Creek." "You're safe now," Preston assured her, his hand gently caressing her rounded belly where their second child grew. "All of you, always." On a crisp November morning with the first snow dusting the mountain peaks, Felicity gave birth to a daughter. Preston paced outside their bedroom, while Mrs. Miller and the midwife attended to Felicity, Thomas watching his father with curious eyes from his place on the bench in the hallway. When the midwife finally opened the door, her smile told Preston everything he needed to know. "A beautiful girl," she announced. "Strong lungs on that one." Preston entered the bedroom to find Felicity propped up against the pillows, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up at him, tired but radiant. "Come meet your daughter," she invited softly. Preston sat carefully on the edge of the bed, taking in the perfect tiny face framed by wisps of dark hair. When the baby opened her eyes, he saw that they were the exact shade of blue-green as Felicity's. "She's perfect," he whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around his, and Preston felt his heart expand with a love so overwhelming it almost hurt. "What shall we name her?" Felicity asked. Preston considered for a moment. "How about Hope? Because that's what she represents. Hope for our future, for the life we're building together." "Hope," Felicity repeated, testing the name. "Hope Zane, I love it." Thomas was brought in to meet his sister, his gray eyes wide with wonder as he peered at the tiny baby. "Baby," he said clearly, one of the few words in his growing vocabulary. "That's right," Preston confirmed, lifting his son onto the bed beside Felicity. "Your baby sister, Hope." As they sat together, a family complete and whole, Felicity reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the shame and fear that had driven her to flee Copper Creek with an infant Thomas, to the peace and joy she now felt surrounded by the love of her husband and children. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations," Felicity replied, looking up at him with eyes full of love. "And how grateful I am that you found us that day in the barn." "I think we found each other," Preston corrected gently. "And I plan to keep finding you every day for the rest of our lives." As winter settled over the Triple Z ranch, the Zane family grew stronger with each passing day. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler with his father's determined nature, appointed himself his sister's guardian, bringing his toys to share and patting her tiny head with surprising gentleness. Hope thrived under the loving attention of her family, her sweet temperament a joy to everyone in the household. Preston and Felicity's love deepened with each challenge they faced and overcame together. The ranch prospered under their joint care, becoming one of the most respected operations in the territory. Preston's breeding program gained recognition beyond Colorado, bringing buyers from as far as California and Texas. In the evenings, they would gather in Felicity's library, now the heart of their home. Preston would read aloud while Felicity nursed Hope, and Thomas played contentedly at their feet. These quiet moments, Preston often thought, were worth more than all the cattle and land in the West. 5 years later, on a bright summer day, Preston stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Felicity taught Thomas and Hope how to plant sunflower seeds along the garden fence. Their third child, 3-year-old James, named in honor of the man who had been Felicity's first husband, toddled after his siblings, determined to keep up. The sound of their laughter carried on the warm breeze, and Preston felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. What had begun as an act of compassion helping a desperate widow and her baby had transformed into the greatest blessing of his life. Felicity looked up, catching his gaze across the yard. The love that passed between them was as tangible as the mountains that framed their home. She smiled, that same smile that had captivated him that night in the Golden Eagle Saloon, and Preston knew with absolute certainty that some things were simply meant to be even if they took a winding path to get there. As Thomas ran to him, shouting excitedly about the seeds he'd planted, Preston scooped his son into his arms. Hope and James followed, clamoring for their father's attention. Felicity joined them, slipping her arm around Preston's waist. "Happy?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Preston looked at his family, the family he had never expected to have, the family born from a moment of kindness in an abandoned barn, and nodded. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, bending to kiss her as their children giggled around them. "More than I ever dreamed."